Emily stood at the window of her new apartment, watching the late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden hue across the quiet street. It was peaceful here, unlike the chaos of the city she had left behind. The move had been a long time coming, her fresh start, a new chapter after the disaster of the past year. The apartment wasn't perfect. It was small, a bit old-fashioned, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was hers. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was in control of her life. She smiled to herself as she unpacked the last of the kitchen boxes, stacking dishes and placing silverware into drawers. It was almost cozy, and the soft, steady sounds of the neighborhood were a welcome backdrop to the quietness inside. As she moved into the bedroom, she started clearing out the closet, determined to make the place feel more like home. The previous tenant had left it in a bit of a mess. Dust-covered shelves, random hangers, and a pile of old newspapers. Kneeling down to brush out the last of the dust, her hand hit something hard. The floorboard beneath her had a strange looseness to it. Intrigued, she pried it up, revealing a small hidden compartment underneath. Inside was a stack of old notebooks, each one bound in leather, worn and aged by time. Emily frowned.
What the?
There was no name on them, no indication of who they belonged to. She dusted one off and opened it, flipping through the first few pages. The handwriting was neat, almost too precise, each letter perfectly aligned as if written with care. The dates caught her attention first, pages of dated entries. June, July, August. The most recent one wasn't even a month old. She skimmed the first entry.
June 12th, 2023. Emily was late to work again today. She rushed out of her apartment at 7:45 a.m., forgetting her keys. She had to come back up to get them. She wore the blue dress, the one she thinks makes her look slim. She stopped for coffee at the cafe on the corner. Black coffee, no sugar, as always.
Emily froze. The blue dress, that cafe. She read the entry again, more slowly this time. Her eyes widened as the details began to sink in. That was her life. Every detail of that morning was exactly what she had done. Her heart thudded in her chest. She flipped to the next entry.
June 20th, 2023. Emily stayed late at the office tonight, hoping her boss would notice her hard work. She doesn't realize he already made his decision about the promotion last week. She got home at 9:15 p.m., exhausted. She ordered takeout, Thai food again. She didn't finish it.
A shiver ran down her spine. That night. That specific night. How could someone know that? Breathing more rapidly now, Emily skimmed further. Every page was filled with similar observations, cataloging her life in meticulous detail. Where she went, what she wore, who she spoke to. She stood up, stumbling back from the closet, the notebook slipping from her hands and landing with a soft thud on the floor. Her mind raced with questions, but one screamed louder than the others. Who had written this? Emily reached for the phone, her hands trembling. She needed to call someone. The police? A friend? Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure. But as her panic subsided, curiosity clawed its way to the surface. She needed to know more. Taking a deep breath, she sat down and flipped through more pages, her eyes devouring every word. Hours passed, and the sun had long since set. Emily had gone through half of the notebooks by now, each one filled with the same unsettling entries, every moment of her life laid out in vivid detail. But one entry stood out.
July 8th, 2023. Emily left work early today. She sat by the fountain in the park for 35 minutes, lost in thought. She kept glancing at her phone, waiting for a message that would never come.
Her breath caught in her throat. That was the day she had waited for Greg to call her. It was the day they broke up. But no one knew how long she'd sat at the park, staring at her phone, waiting in vain. No one had been there. She flipped forward, her fingers trembling as they turned the pages faster and faster. The entries continued with chilling precision, recounting everything she had done in the last year. And then she reached the final entry of the notebook she was holding.
August 18th, 2024. Emily finds the first notebook today.
Emily stared at the words, her pulse racing. Today's date, August 18th. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she dropped the notebook. The room felt smaller, the air thick and suffocating. Someone had been watching her, not just in the past, but right now. Someone knew she would find these diaries. She stood up quickly, her legs unsteady, her head spinning. Was it a sick joke? How could they have known? Her eyes darted around the apartment, scanning every corner, every shadow. She rushed to the window, glancing out into the darkness, searching for any sign of movement outside. But the street was quiet, just like before. Too quiet. Her phone buzzed on the counter, making her jump. Emily grabbed it with shaky hands. A new message lit up the screen.
Did you like my diary?
She dropped the phone, as if it had burned her, backing away from the counter. Her eyes darted toward the window again, the shadows outside suddenly darker, more menacing. Someone was watching her, right now. That was the only explanation. Forcing herself to stay calm, Emily grabbed the phone again, staring at the message. There was no number attached to it, no name. Just those words, taunting her. Who could have sent this? And how did they know she'd found the diaries? A flood of thoughts crashed over her. Should she call the police? Would they even take her seriously? What if they're close by? What if they're watching right now? Her mind raced and her breath quickened. She needed answers. Fingers trembling, she typed out a reply.
Who is this?
She hit send and stared at the screen, waiting. Seconds felt like hours as her pulse drummed in her ears. The phone remained silent, no response coming. She couldn't sit still, pacing the small apartment, every creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of anxiety through her. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. She snatched it up, the notification lighting up the screen.
Don't be scared, Emily. I've always been close.
Her heart pounded harder. Close. That word echoed in her mind. She spun around the room as if the sender might appear right behind her. Was it someone in the building? A neighbor? The thought sent a cold wave of dread washing over her. She glanced out of the window again, scanning the street, looking for anyone standing too still or watching from a distance. But there was no one. Just the empty street and the occasional car passing by. The air in the apartment felt thick, suffocating. She needed to get out. She grabbed her jacket, threw it on, and bolted out the door, locking it behind her. Her feet pounded down the stairwell, almost slipping as she rushed outside. The cool night air hit her face like a slap, but it wasn't enough to calm the whirlwind of panic that had taken hold of her. She turned, looking up at her apartment window. For a moment, she half expected to see a figure standing in her place, peering down at her. But there was nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched weighed heavily on her. Emily's mind raced. Who could be doing this? Her ex, Greg. He was possessive, but this felt far too extreme, even for him. Was it a prank? Some kind of twisted joke? The possibilities spun endlessly in her mind, but none of them made her feel any safer. She started walking down the street, her feet carrying her instinctively toward the small cafe she frequented. It was late, but she knew it stayed open for the night owls. Right now, she needed the comfort of being around other people. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a couple tucked in the corner and an elderly man nursing a coffee at the counter. Emily ordered a drink, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled as she handed the cashier her card. She found a small table in the back and sat down, pulling out her phone again. She stared at the screen, unsure of what to do next. Call a friend? The police? She didn't even know where to start. Before she could decide, the phone buzzed again.
Running won't help.
The words sent a chill racing up her spine. She looked around the cafe, her eyes scanning the few patrons, her mind racing with paranoia. Was one of them the stalker? Were they here, watching her every move? Emily's breath quickened as she typed a response.
Who are you? What do you want?
She hit send, her fingers shaking as she clutched the phone tightly. This time the response was almost immediate.
I want to help you. I know you better than anyone. I've seen your struggles. I can guide you.
Her stomach churned. Guide her. What kind of twisted logic was this? She felt sick, her mind reeling from the absurdity of it all. But before she could type a reply, another message appeared.
You're scared now, but you'll understand soon. Go back to the apartment. There's something you need to see.
Emily's heart sank. The thought of going back there made her skin crawl. She stared down at the phone, her mind screaming to just call the police, tell them everything. But a part of her, the part driven by a morbid curiosity, wanted to know what this person was leading her to. She needed answers. If she went back, maybe she could find a clue, something that would tell her who this person was. Her fingers hovered over the phone's keypad, ready to dial for help, but instead she found herself standing, grabbing her bag, and walking back out into the night. Emily's apartment was dead silent when she returned. She hesitated at the door, every instinct telling her to turn back, but the overwhelming need for answers drove her forward. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air thick with tension. Everything was as she had left it, the notebooks still strewn across the floor, the closet door slightly ajar. She stood in the center of the room, her body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Her phone buzzed.
The notebook on the floor, read the first entry.
Emily's heart thudded in her chest. Her eyes fell to the notebook she had dropped earlier. The thought of picking it up again made her stomach twist, but her feet moved on their own, carrying her to the center of the room. Slowly, she knelt down, picked up the notebook, and opened it. Her eyes scanned the first entry.
May 1st, 2023. Emily passes by me in the hallway. She smiles. She doesn't know who I am yet, but she will. Soon.
Her blood ran cold. She flipped through more pages, each one detailing her interactions in the apartment building, the brief exchanges with neighbors, the people she passed by, without a second thought. They had been watching her for longer than she'd realized, and then she saw it. A name buried halfway down the page, her downstairs neighbor, Mr. Halverson, the elderly man she had passed a dozen times. He'd always been kind, offering a smile or a friendly nod. She hadn't thought twice about him. He seemed harmless. But now, as she read the words, her stomach turned. The man downstairs, the one who'd always been there, had been writing about her life, observing her every move. And tonight, he knew she had found his diary. Emily stood up, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her, suffocating her. Another message appeared on her phone.
Come downstairs, Emily, let's talk.
Her mind raced, torn between the primal urge to flee and the morbid curiosity that had gotten her this far. Mr. Halverson, her seemingly harmless elderly neighbor, was the one behind the disturbing diaries. But why? And what did he mean by, "let's talk"? The apartment felt claustrophobic, walls closing in as her breath quickened. She couldn't stay here, but the thought of going downstairs, confronting him, filled her with dread. Was he dangerous, or just some lonely old man with an unhealthy obsession? You need to know. The thought, heavy and insistent, pressed on her. She grabbed her phone and hesitated before texting back.
Why? Why did you do this?
Seconds ticked by. No response. Emily clenched her fists, every instinct screaming to call the police, to get out. But she knew this wouldn't end without answers. The growing weight of dread pushed her toward the door. Steeling herself, she slipped on her shoes, grabbed her keys, and walked toward the hallway. The stairwell was eerily quiet as she descended, each creak of the steps reverberating in the still air. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath. When she reached the ground floor, she paused, staring at the familiar door to Mr. Halverson's apartment. It was just a door, innocuous like any other, but now it felt like a gateway into something darker. She raised her hand to knock, but stopped short. What if he was waiting for her on the other side? Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she took a deep breath, then knocked. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, and there stood Mr. Halverson, his face as calm and friendly as always. The same smile that had once seemed warm now sent shivers down her spine.
"Emily,"
he said, his voice smooth and gentle.
"I was wondering when you'd come."
Her throat went dry.
Why are you doing this? The diaries, the messages, why?
He chuckled softly, stepping aside.
"Come in, I'll explain everything."
Emily hesitated, the hallway feeling safer somehow, but she needed to hear what he had to say. She stepped inside, her heart racing. The apartment was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture and stacks of books. It smelled faintly of dust and something else. Something sour. Mr. Halverson closed the door behind her and gestured to the worn armchair.
"Sit down, please."
She didn't want to sit, didn't want to feel trapped, but she reluctantly lowered herself into the chair, her eyes never leaving him. He sat across from her, his gaze calm, as though this were a perfectly normal conversation.
"You're probably wondering why I've been keeping an eye on you,"
he began, folding his hands in his lap.
"It's because I care. I've watched you for a long time, Emily. You're lost. You're lonely. And I've seen how much you've struggled. I just wanted to help."
Help?
She echoed, her voice shaking.
You've been stalking me, writing about my life, sending me messages. How is that helping?
He sighed softly, shaking his head.
"You don't understand. This world is filled with people who don't care about you. I've seen it, how they treat you. Your friends, your co-workers, even Greg. No one really understands you like I do."
Emily's skin crawled at the mention of Greg.
You don't know me. You've just been watching me. That's not the same.
He leaned forward, his expression suddenly intense.
"But I do know you, Emily. Better than anyone else. You've lived your life surrounded by people who don't see you for who you really are. I see you. I've seen your pain, your loneliness, and I wanted to be there for you, to guide you."
Her heart pounded in her chest.
You think this is some kind of twisted kindness? You've violated my privacy?
"Privacy?"
He interrupted, a sharp edge to his voice now.
"Privacy is a lie, Emily. People like you walk through life pretending they're alone, pretending no one's watching. But there's always someone watching, always someone who knows the truth. You should be grateful."
Emily stood, her legs shaky but resolute.
I'm not grateful. You've been manipulating me, scaring me. This isn't about helping me. This is about control.
His eyes darkened.
"I'm the only one who can help you, Emily. No one else will."
Her skin prickled as she backed away toward the door.
You're wrong. I don't need you.
She turned, hand on the doorknob, when his voice stopped her cold.
"Don't go back upstairs."
She froze, the weight of his words settling in her chest like a stone.
"You're not safe up there anymore,"
he said, his voice low and almost sad.
"I told you to read the notebook for a reason. There's more going on than you realize. I've been watching you because I care. But now someone else is watching too, and they aren't as kind as I am."
Emily's breath caught in her throat.
What are you talking about?
His gaze softened, and for a moment he almost looked apologetic.
"You should never have found the notebooks. They weren't meant for you. Someone else left them there. I was trying to protect you, but now it's too late."
Who left them?
Mr. Halverson shook his head slowly.
"I don't know, but they've been watching both of us for a long time. And now that you've found the diaries, they'll come for you."
Emily's mind raced, a flurry of thoughts clashing with her pounding heartbeat. Someone else? Someone had been watching her, watching him, this entire time?
I can protect you,
Mr. Halverson continued.
but you need to trust me.
Emily's hand tightened on the doorknob. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. But if there was someone else, if this went deeper than she thought. She shook her head, backing out of the apartment.
I don't need your help.
Without waiting for his response, she opened the door and fled up the stairs, her pulse racing with every step. Her apartment loomed before her, feeling darker, more foreboding than ever. She rushed inside, locking the door behind her. She leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, but her eyes were drawn to the notebooks scattered on the floor. Hesitating for only a moment, she knelt down and opened one of the remaining notebooks, flipping quickly through the pages. And then she saw it, an entry written in a different handwriting, rough, messy, almost frantic.
August 18th, 2024. Emily finds the notebooks today. I've been waiting for her. Now I'll see if she can figure out what I've planned. If not, well, it's already too late.
Her phone buzzed. Emily stared down at it, her hands trembling as she picked it up and read the new message.
I told you not to go back upstairs.
Her heart pounded in her chest, every thud louder than the last. Mr. Halverson had warned her, and now whoever had left that cryptic notebook message was watching her too. Someone else had been in her apartment, someone who had been waiting for her to make a mistake. Her eyes darted around the room, every shadow suddenly more menacing, every corner holding the possibility of something or someone lurking there. This wasn't just about Mr. Halverson anymore. Someone far more dangerous was involved. She needed help. Fingers trembling, she dialed 911. The phone rang in her ear, but no one picked up. Confusion and frustration surged through her. She tried again, but once more, the call failed.
Come on.
Emily muttered, her voice trembling as she checked the signal. There was nothing wrong with it. The call should have gone through. But somehow, it didn't. Whoever's doing this, they're in control. Her pulse quickened. She needed to get out of there, fast. Emily grabbed her bag, threw on her jacket, and bolted for the door. But before her hand reached the knob, her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look at it, but some morbid curiosity made her glance down.
You're not leaving, Emily.
Her stomach turned. She spun around, her eyes scanning the apartment. She felt trapped, suffocated by the walls that seemed to close in on her. She had to leave, now. But as she turned back to the door, a soft knock echoed from the other side. Emily froze, her hand inches from the knob. The knock came again, this time a little louder. She didn't want to open it. Whoever was out there, she wasn't ready to face them. But the knocking persisted, 3 sharp raps that seemed to reverberate through the room. Emily's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she took a step back, her hand shaking. Then the voice came, muffled but unmistakable.
Emily, it's Mr. Halverson.
Her mind spun. Was it really him? Had he come up here? Or was this part of the stalker's twisted game? The apartment was so quiet that she could hear the blood rushing in her ears.
Emily,
The voice came again, softer this time.
please open the door. We need to talk.
She hesitated for a moment, her body tense, her instincts at war. What if this was another trap? What if whoever was watching her had planned this moment? But her fear of the unknown, the terror of being completely alone against whatever force was stalking her, made her decision for her. Slowly she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. Mr. Halverson stood there, his face lined with concern. He didn't look like the dangerous stalker she had imagined him to be earlier. Instead, he seemed tired, worn down by the events of the night.
Emily,
He said quietly.
I told you not to come back here.
She stared at him, the fear bubbling up again.
Who is it? Who's watching me?
He stepped closer, his eyes grave.
It's not just one person. You've been caught in something much bigger than you realize.
Emily frowned.
What do you mean? What's going on?
Mr. Halverson's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe.
I was watching you, yes. I've been following you for a long time, but I was only trying to protect you from the real danger.
The real danger?
Her voice was barely a whisper.
There's someone else, someone who's been following both of us. I don't know who they are, but they've been planning this for a long time. I think they're using us, Emily, and they're not going to stop.
Her hands went cold as the weight of his words sank in. She thought she'd uncovered the mystery, thought that confronting Mr. Halverson would give her answers, but instead she was being drawn deeper into something far more sinister.
Why me?
She asked, her voice shaking.
Why did they target me?
I don't know,
He admitted.
but whoever they are, they know more about you than I ever did. They've been in your life for longer than you think. The notebooks, the messages, they're all part of their game.
Emily swallowed hard, feeling the walls of her apartment close in around her. It wasn't just Mr. Halverson. Someone else had been manipulating her, watching her every move, and now they had her right where they wanted. She backed away from the door, her mind racing.
I don't trust you.
She said, her voice trembling.
I know.
Mr. Halverson replied quietly.
But you don't have to trust me. You just have to trust that whoever's behind this, they're coming for you. And you need to get out of here, now.
Emily hesitated, the fear gripping her tightly, but deep down she knew he was right. She couldn't stay here. The apartment wasn't safe anymore. She grabbed her bag again, stuffing the notebooks inside. If they held any clues, she needed to take them with her.
Where can I go?
She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Halverson's eyes flickered to the hallway, his face set in a grim line.
There's a motel on the outskirts of town. It's off the grid, a place where they won't find you right away. I'll meet you there. We'll figure this out together.
She didn't know if she could trust him, but staying here wasn't an option. Her entire body was trembling as she stepped out of the apartment, locking the door behind her. Emily drove through the night, the darkness swallowing the road ahead of her. The city's lights faded behind her as she headed toward the desolate outskirts, her eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The motel appeared out of the gloom like a forgotten relic, its flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows across the empty lot. She pulled in, her heart racing as she parked the car and stepped out. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that sent a shiver down her spine. She hurried inside, checking into a room at the far end of the lot. The clerk barely glanced at her, a gruff man who looked like he'd seen it all and didn't care. The room was small and shabby, but it felt safer than her apartment. For now. Emily locked the door, pulling the curtains shut as she sat on the edge of the bed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. She pulled it out, dreading the message she knew was waiting for her.
I see you.
Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the words. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Another buzz. A second message.
You can't run, Emily. I've been with you all along.
She dropped the phone, her hands shaking as she backed away from the bed. The words played over and over in her mind, twisting her thoughts into knots. Whoever it was, they knew where she was. They'd always known. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't pick it up. She couldn't bear to see what it said next. Instead, she sank to the floor, her back pressed against the door, feeling the weight of everything crash down on her. She was being hunted, and no matter how far she ran, they would always be there, watching her. Emily sat on the cold, cracked tile floor of the motel room, her back pressed firmly against the door, as if she could somehow block out the weight of the messages and the terror they carried. Her phone lay on the bed, the screen still glowing with the last message. "You can't run, Emily. I've been with you all along." Her mind whirled, desperately trying to piece everything together. Mr. Halverson had warned her that she was being watched by someone else, someone far more dangerous. But who? And how long had this other person been lurking in the shadows of her life? Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps outside her door. They were soft but distinct, approaching slowly. Her breath caught in her throat as she pressed her ear to the door, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped directly outside. Her heart pounded in her chest as she held her breath, waiting for the knock that never came. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before she finally exhaled, her body trembling. She couldn't stay here. They had already found her. She needed to leave again, get further away, somewhere they couldn't follow her. But where could she go? If they had been with her all along, as the message said, it didn't matter where she ran. They would find her. They always did. Her phone buzzed again. Emily hesitated, but finally she grabbed it and looked down.
You don't need to run, Emily. I'm already inside.
A wave of cold terror washed over her. Inside? Her eyes darted around the room, every shadow suddenly feeling darker, every creak of the building more menacing. The curtains shifted slightly as a draft slipped through the window, making her heart race even faster. Panic seized her as she scrambled to her feet, backing toward the bathroom. She needed to escape, find another way out, but she felt trapped. The tiny room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. Her mind screamed for her to flee, but her legs felt heavy, glued to the ground. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. This time it wasn't a soft tap, but 3 hard, deliberate knocks that echoed through the room. Emily's breath hitched, her hands shaking as she stood frozen in place, staring at the door. She didn't want to open it. She couldn't. But her body moved on its own, driven by equal parts fear and the need for answers. She reached for the knob, her fingers trembling as she twisted it and pulled the door open a crack. Standing there, under the dim glow of the motel's flickering neon sign, was Mr. Halverson.
Emily,
He said softly, his voice edged with urgency.
you need to come with me now.
She hesitated, unsure whether she could trust him.
You told me to run. You said they were coming for me.
They are.
He replied, his face grim.
But you can't outrun them. They're everywhere. We need to disappear together.
Emily's mind raced, confusion and fear swirling together. She didn't trust him, couldn't trust him. But at the same time, she was desperate. Desperate for answers, desperate for a way out.
How do I know you're not working with them?
She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Halverson's eyes flickered with frustration. But there was something else there, too, something that looked like fear.
You don't. But if you stay here, they'll take you, and you'll never see daylight again. You have to trust me.
Emily's pulse quickened, her instincts screaming at her to shut the door and run in the opposite direction. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had been hunted, manipulated, and cornered. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until they had her. With one last look at the empty motel room behind her, Emily made her decision. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The night was colder now, the wind biting at her skin as she and Mr. Halverson walked briskly to his car. The parking lot was deserted, a sea of dark shadows stretching across the cracked asphalt. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, feeling like eyes were following her from every corner. They got into the car, the interior silent and tense, as Mr. Halverson started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the desolate road ahead.
Where are we going?
Emily asked, her voice barely steady.
There's a safe house.
Mr. Halverson replied, his eyes fixed on the road.
It's off the grid. They won't find us there.
Emily stared out the window. the unease twisting in her gut.
Who are they? You keep talking about them, but you never explain who they are.
He didn't answer right away, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and hesitant.
I don't know exactly. They're a group, people who watch, who manipulate. They target specific individuals, like you, like me. And once you're in their sights, they never let you go.
Emily shuddered, her stomach tightening.
Why me?
Mr. Halverson glanced at her, his expression softening.
Because you're special. You've been marked for something they want. I don't know what, but I've seen them do it before. They find people, follow them, and take them.
She swallowed hard, her throat dry.
Take them for what?
I don't know,
He admitted.
but no one ever comes back.
The words hung heavy in the air, the gravity of what he was saying sinking in. Whoever these people were, they had been watching her, manipulating her life for reasons she couldn't understand. And if they found her, it would be over. They drove in silence for miles, the road winding through dark, desolate woods. Emily's thoughts spiraled, trying to make sense of everything. Every piece of the puzzle only seemed to deepen the mystery. Finally, the car pulled off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path, the headlights bouncing off the trees as they drove deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around them, the outside world disappearing behind the thick wall of branches and shadows.
We're almost there.
Mr. Halverson said quietly. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the car slowed to a stop in front of a small, secluded cabin. The windows were dark, the place barely visible through the dense trees.
This is the safe house?
Emily asked, her voice tinged with disbelief.
It's safe.
Mr. Halverson replied, cutting the engine.
For now.
They got out of the car, the air around them eerily still. Emily felt a wave of unease wash over her as she stared at the cabin. It didn't feel safe. It felt like a trap, but there was nowhere else to go. Inside, the cabin was small and bare, with only a few pieces of furniture and a single dim light casting long shadows across the walls. Mr. Halverson moved quickly, locking the doors and closing the blinds before turning to face her.
We should be safe here for the night,
he said, his voice low. Emily stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself.
What happens now?
Mr. Halverson met her gaze, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place.
Now, we wait.
She didn't like the sound of that.
Wait for what?
Wait for them to make their move.
He said grimly.
They won't give up, Emily, but we'll be ready when they come.
Emily's stomach twisted as the reality of the situation settled over her. She was trapped in a game she didn't understand, with no way out. And now all she could do was wait for the next move. As the night stretched on, the silence of the cabin grew heavier, the shadows darker. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Something was watching them, something was coming, and when it did, there would be no place left to hide. The cabin was eerily quiet, the stillness heavy as Emily sat on the edge of an old, worn couch, her mind racing. Mr. Halverson moved about the small space, checking windows and doors, but each lock he secured felt futile. The oppressive weight of the situation hung over them like a storm cloud, and Emily's unease only grew by the minute. She had come to this safe house with him because she was desperate. But now, alone in the middle of nowhere, the isolation gnawed at her. Her phone, lying useless on the table in front of her, was a constant reminder that she was cut off from the outside world. Even if she wanted to call for help, who would believe her now? And worse, who would even be able to help? As Mr. Halverson finished securing the cabin, he finally turned to face her, his expression grim.
They won't find us here.
He said, but the conviction in his voice faltered.
At least not tonight.
Emily looked up at him, doubt written all over her face.
You keep saying they. Who are they, and why do they want me? You've been dodging my questions all night.
Mr. Halverson hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the darkened windows as though expecting something or someone to appear at any moment.
It's complicated.
He began slowly, but Emily cut him off.
No more half answers. I'm done running. I'm done hiding. You owe me the truth.
Her voice trembled with frustration, but her resolve was clear. Mr. Halverson sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair.
You're right. You deserve the truth. But the truth, it's not something you'll want to hear.
Emily's stomach twisted with dread. She'd come this far. She needed to know.
Tell me.
He sat down across from her, his expression tired and worn, as though carrying the weight of the knowledge had drained him over the years.
I've been watching you for a long time, Emily,
he said softly.
But I wasn't the first. There's a group, people who control things from behind the scenes. They manipulate lives, pull strings, watch everything. Most people never know they exist, but some, like you, become targets.
Why me?
Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
I don't know,
he admitted, his voice tinged with regret.
But you were marked. I tried to intervene to protect you, but they're relentless. Once they set their sights on someone, it's almost impossible to escape.
Emily's pulse quickened.
What do they want from me?
Mr. Halverson's gaze darkened.
They don't just watch. They take people. I don't know where or why, but no one ever comes back. They're very selective, but once you're marked, they will do whatever it takes to get you.
Emily's hands gripped the edge of the couch as her mind raced.
So you've been trying to protect me?
Yes,
he replied, his voice steady.
But I made a mistake. The notebooks, they weren't meant for you to find. I left them there to throw them off, to make them think I was losing track of you. But somehow they turned it against me.
Her mind spun, trying to process the revelation. She was being hunted by a shadowy group that manipulated lives from behind the scenes. It sounded like a nightmare, but everything she had experienced pointed to one thing. It was real. Before she could ask another question, the cabin's lights flickered. The soft hum of electricity buzzed in the air for a moment, then died, plunging them into darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the sudden silence pressed in around them.
What's happening?
She whispered, her voice trembling. Mr. Halverson stood, his posture tense.
They found us.
Emily's heart pounded in her chest.
How? You said this place was off the grid.
They have ways,
he muttered, his voice low.
We need to leave now.
Panic surged through her veins.
Where will we go? There's nowhere to hide.
Mr. Halverson grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer, its beam cutting through the thick darkness.
We can't stay here. If they've found us, they'll close in soon.
He moved toward the back door, gesturing for Emily to follow. Her legs felt heavy, her body frozen with fear, but the urgency in his voice snapped her into action. She grabbed her phone and hurried after him. The night outside was suffocating, the dense woods around the cabin swallowing the faint light from Mr. Halverson's flashlight. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches twisting in the wind. Emily's breath came in shallow bursts as she followed him, every sound in the woods amplified by the stillness. They moved quickly, their footsteps crunching on the forest floor, but the oppressive sense of being watched hung over them. Emily glanced over her shoulder more than once, her eyes searching the shadows for movement, convinced that something or someone was following. As they wound deeper into the woods, Mr. Halverson slowed, his breathing labored. Emily looked at him, worry creeping into her voice.
Where are we going?
There's an old trail,
he said between breaths.
It leads to a clearing. If we can make it there, we'll have a chance.
A chance at what?
She asked, her pulse quickening again.
Survival,
he muttered darkly. But before they could move any further, Emily felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread, like cold fingers brushing the back of her neck. She stopped in her tracks, her skin prickling. She wasn't imagining it. Something was watching them. Mr. Halverson turned to her, his face tense.
Keep moving,
He urged.
We're almost...
A sudden rustling sound cut through the stillness, and Emily's blood ran cold. The sound wasn't coming from behind them. It was ahead, in the trees. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest, as the rustling grew louder, closer. The beam from Mr. Halverson's flashlight flickered across the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with every movement. And then they saw it. A figure, tall, shrouded in darkness, standing at the edge of the trail, barely visible between the trees. Its form was indistinct, but there was something unmistakably wrong about the way it moved, as if it didn't belong to this world. Emily's breath hitched as the figure stepped closer, the shadows clinging to it like a second skin. Mr. Halverson grabbed her arm, pulling her back.
Run,
He whispered, his voice shaking. Without thinking, Emily turned and sprinted into the forest, her legs burning as she tore through the trees. The fear coursing through her veins was primal, overwhelming, as though every fiber of her being knew she was being hunted. Behind her, she could hear Mr. Halverson's footsteps, but they were uneven, slower than hers. Her heart pounded in her ears, the sound almost drowning out the rustling of leaves and snapping branches around them. Suddenly, there was a sharp cry. Mr. Halverson's voice, followed by a heavy thud. Emily skidded to a stop, her chest heaving. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but the darkness behind her was impenetrable. She could see nothing, hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart.
Mr. Halverson?
She whispered, her voice trembling. No answer. The forest was silent. Too silent. Her mind screamed at her to keep running, but something held her in place. A mix of fear and guilt. She couldn't just leave him. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped cautiously back toward where she had last heard him, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The beam flickered across the trees, revealing nothing but darkness.
Mr. Halverson?
She called again, louder this time. Still nothing. And then from the darkness ahead, she heard a soft, whispering voice. So quiet, she almost missed it.
Emily.
Her blood ran cold. It wasn't Mr. Halverson's voice.
Emily.
The voice came again, softer now, but closer. Her breath caught in her throat. Whoever, or whatever, was out there. It was coming for her. Finally, her body jolted into action. She spun on her heels and bolted, sprinting through the forest, branches slapping against her skin as she pushed through the underbrush. Her pulse hammered, in her ears Duru rounding out every sound except for her ragged breathing and the pounding of her feet on the forest floor. She didn't know where she was going. She just had to get away. But as she ran, that same dread she had felt before began creeping back into her mind. They were watching her, closing in. She could feel it. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what Mr. Halverson had told her. He had mentioned them again and again. But now she was starting to believe that this wasn't just some mysterious organization. This was something far more dangerous, something far less human. The trees grew thicker as she ran deeper into the forest, the path ahead barely visible in the dim glow of her flashlight. She tripped over a root, stumbling forward, her hands scraping against the dirt as she caught herself. She was breathing hard, her chest burning, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Behind her she heard the sound again, rustling, quiet but unmistakable. It was following her. Her legs burned as she forced herself to her feet, running even faster. But no matter how hard she pushed herself, the feeling of being hunted only intensified. Then, out of nowhere, the forest opened up. She burst into a clearing, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on the empty space. For a brief moment, she felt exposed, as though the shadows were watching her from all sides. But before she could react, something moved on the other side of the clearing. a figure, standing perfectly still at the edge of the trees. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was tall, indistinct, as though the darkness itself had taken shape. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, watching her.
Emily.
The whisper came again, but this time it didn't sound distant. It sounded like it was right next to her, as if it was coming from inside her own mind. Her entire body trembled, fear rooting her in place. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The figure at the edge of the clearing shifted slightly, its form blending with the shadows around it. Then, before she could process what was happening, something changed. The figure wasn't alone. More shadows began to emerge from the trees, each one moving silently, their forms indistinct, but undeniably human-shaped. They moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, as if the ground beneath them didn't exist. Emily's eyes widened in terror. This can't be real. Her feet finally obeyed her instincts, and she bolted again, sprinting across the clearing toward the trees on the other side. But with every step, she could feel them closing in. The shadows moved faster than they should have, their movements unnaturally quick, gliding across the ground like phantoms. Her chest burned as she reached the tree line, pushing through the branches, ignoring the cuts and scrapes on her arms. She had to get away. She had to escape. But the voices followed her.
Emily.
She didn't stop, couldn't stop. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees growing thicker, the air colder. She stumbled again, this time falling hard onto the ground, her flashlight skittering out of her hand. She scrambled to her feet, panic surging through her as she searched for the light.
Emily.
The voice was so close now, too close. Her shaking fingers finally grasped the flashlight, and she swung it around, the beam cutting through the darkness. But as the light flickered across the trees, something moved in the shadows ahead of her. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked onto the figure standing just feet away. It was a man, tall, thin, and completely still. His face was shrouded in darkness, but his presence radiated a cold, unnatural energy. Emily's grip tightened on the flashlight as she took a step back. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stared at her with eyes she couldn't see, but could feel. And then in one swift motion, he stepped forward. Emily's heart lurched as she stumbled back, fear paralyzing her limbs. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The man was moving toward her, his steps slow but deliberate, like he had all the time in the world.
Who are you?
Emily finally managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. The man stopped, his head tilting slightly, as if considering her question. Then he smiled, a cold, eerie smile that made her blood run cold.
I've been watching you for a long time, Emily.
He said softly, his voice smooth and unsettling.
Longer than you realize.
Emily's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was the one. This was the person Mr. Halverson had warned her about. The real stalker, the one who had been controlling everything.
What do you want from me?
The man's smile widened.
You were chosen, Emily, marked for something greater, but you made a mistake.
Mistake?
She echoed, her heart racing.
You were never supposed to find the notebooks. That was Mr. Halverson's doing. He thought he could save you. He thought he could protect you from us.
Emily's stomach twisted.
Us?
The man nodded slowly.
We are the ones who watch. We are the ones who control. But you weren't supposed to know.
Emily took another step back, her mind reeling.
What do you want from me?
The man's eyes gleamed in the darkness, his smile fading.
It's too late, Emily. You've seen too much. You've learned too much. Now you belong to us.
Her body went cold, her breath catching in her throat.
No, I won't let you.
But before she could finish, the man stepped forward again, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. Emily's legs buckled beneath her as the weight of his words crashed down on her.
You can't run anymore, Emily.
He whispered, his voice like a shadow in her mind.
There's nowhere left to hide.
Emily's vision blurred as the darkness closed in around her, the shadows swallowing the world. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the man's voice, soft and cold.
Welcome to the shadows.
Emily's world dissolved into blackness, her mind slipping into an icy void. The whisper of the man's voice lingered in her thoughts, echoing in the darkness. When she awoke, it wasn't to the familiar hum of city life or the comfort of her bed. Instead, the room around her was dimly lit, sterile, and unsettlingly cold. Her limbs felt heavy, weighed down by an unseen force. She blinked several times, trying to gather her bearings, but the fog clouding her thoughts made it hard to focus. Where was she? How had she gotten here? Panic surged through her as she struggled to sit up. The cold metal table beneath her sent chills through her body. Emily tried to move her arms, but they were strapped down with thick leather restraints. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the room. It was a small, windowless space with bare walls and a single, flickering fluorescent light overhead. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the distant hum of machinery vibrated through the walls. A door in the corner of the room stood closed, its heavy frame imposing in the dim light. There was no way to tell what lay beyond it, but whatever it was, Emily knew it couldn't be good. She tugged at the restraints again, panic setting in as the reality of her situation sank in. She was trapped. There was no escape. Suddenly the door creaked open, and Emily's breath hitched as a tall figure stepped inside. It was the man from the woods, his presence just as unsettling in the harsh, sterile light. His cold, emotionless eyes locked onto hers as he slowly approached. Emily's pulse raced, her voice trembling as she demanded,
What do you want from me? Why am I here?
The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was a smile that made her skin crawl, a smile devoid of any humanity.
You've been chosen, Emily,
he said softly, his voice as smooth and cold as glass.
Chosen for something much greater than yourself.
Emily's mind raced, her thoughts jumbled by fear and confusion.
Chosen for what? What does that mean?
The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his black coat and pulled out one of the notebooks, the same ones she had found hidden in her apartment. He held it up, showing her the familiar worn leather cover.
These were never meant for you, but you found them, and now you're part of something you don't understand.
Emily's stomach churned.
I don't want to be part of this. Let me go.
The man's eyes narrowed, and his smile faded.
It's too late for that. You've seen too much. You've learned too much. Now we have to finish what we started.
Her heart raced as she struggled against the restraints.
Finish what? What are you going to do to me?
He tilted his head slightly, watching her with an almost clinical detachment.
We're going to show you the truth.
Before she could respond, the man stepped aside, revealing a second figure who had entered the room while she was distracted. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the familiar face. Mr. Halverson. His face was drawn, pale, and filled with a strange mix of resignation and fear. His eyes locked onto hers for a moment, and something in his gaze told her that he wasn't in control. He was just as much a prisoner as she was.
Mr. Halverson? What's happening? Why are you here?
The older man didn't answer. He only looked at her with a sadness that made her stomach twist. The man in black stepped forward again, his cold eyes glinting in the harsh light.
Mr. Halverson has been with us for a long time, Emily. He's been watching you, guiding you, but now his role is complete.
What do you mean? What did he do to me?
The man turned to Mr. Halverson, who stood silently, his shoulders slumped in defeat.
He was your guardian. He made sure you stayed on the path we set for you. But now you're ready for the next phase. Mr. Halverson's work is done.
Emily's blood ran cold.
Next phase? What are you talking about? What is this?
The man in black's smile widened slightly.
It's time for you to join us, Emily, to see the world as it really is. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. but you've been chosen for something special.
Emily's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling into panic. She had to get out of here. She couldn't let them do this to her.
I'm not going to be a part of this.
She spat, struggling violently against the restraints.
You can't force me.
The man watched her with detached amusement.
You'll understand soon. This is bigger than you, bigger than any of us.
Before Emily could scream or protest again, the man nodded to Mr. Halverson, who slowly approached her. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for something out of sight.
I'm sorry, Emily.
Mr. Halverson whispered, his voice filled with regret.
I tried to protect you. I tried to keep them from you, but they always win in the end.
No, you can't do this.
Emily cried, her voice breaking as fear overwhelmed her. But it was too late. Mr. Halverson pressed something cold against her skin, a needle. The sharp prick of it made her gasp, her body instinctively jerking away, but the restraints held her in place. Her vision blurred almost instantly, her limbs growing heavy. The room around her began to spin as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. The man in black's face was the last thing she saw before the world faded away. His cold smile burned into her mind. When Emily awoke again, she was no longer in the small room. She was somewhere else entirely. The restraints were gone, but her body felt heavy, almost numb. The space around her was vast, cold, and empty. The walls were dark, featureless, stretching endlessly in all directions. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, that everything she had just experienced was some kind of nightmare. But as she sat up and looked around, the cold reality of her situation settled in. This wasn't a dream. This was real. A soft sound echoed through the space, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once.
Emily.
Where am I? What is this place?
The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it.
Welcome to the shadows, Emily. This is where it all begins.
Emily's heart raced as she tried to process his words.
The shadows? What do you mean?
The man's gaze hardened, his smile fading.
You're one of us now. You've been chosen, and there's no going back.
Emily shook her head, fear and confusion overwhelming her.
I didn't choose this. I don't want any part of this.
The man stepped closer, his presence suffocating.
It doesn't matter what you want. You belong to us now.
Emily backed away, her body trembling. She felt the coldness of the space closing in on her, the darkness swallowing her whole. And then in the distance, she saw them, the figures, dozens of them, shadowy and indistinct, moving through the darkness, watching her. She wasn't alone. She was never alone. Her heart pounded as she realized the horrifying truth. There was no escape, no running, no hiding. She was part of the shadows now. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the shadowy figures move through the darkness. They were everywhere, their shapes blending seamlessly into the void, their movements fluid and unnatural. There was no sound, no whisper of their footsteps, yet she could feel their eyes on her. Watching, waiting. The man in black stood beside her, his cold gaze fixed on her trembling form.
You're one of us now, Emily,
he said softly, his voice as empty and hollow as the shadows that surrounded them.
You've been chosen to see the truth, to become part of something greater.
Emily's mind raced, her thoughts fragmented and scattered.
Chosen for what?
She demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear.
I didn't ask for this. I never wanted any of this.
The man's expression remained unchanged, his calm demeanor unsettling.
It doesn't matter what you wanted. What matters is that you've seen too much. Now you belong to us.
Emily backed away, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling.
I'm not going to be part of this. I'm not going to let you control me.
The man's smile widened slightly, a cruel glint in his eyes.
You misunderstand, Emily. You were never in control. None of us are.
Her heart raced as she glanced around, searching for any way out of the suffocating darkness. But there was nothing. No exit. No escape. only the endless abyss and the shadowy figures that watched her from every corner of the void.
Why me? Why did you choose me?
The man's gaze softened, as though he were contemplating the question.
You were marked long ago, Emily. We've been watching you your entire life, guiding you toward this moment. Everything you've experienced, every choice you've made, has led you here.
Her skin crawled as his words sank in. They've been watching me my whole life. The thought was unbearable, the idea that her every move had been controlled, manipulated, without her ever knowing. Emily shook her head, her voice rising in desperation.
This isn't real. It can't be real.
The man in black stepped closer, his presence overwhelming.
You're in the shadows now, Emily. This is as real as it gets.
Emily's pulse raced, her body trembling with fear. She couldn't let them take her. She couldn't give in. With a sudden burst of defiance, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the unseen ground as she sprinted through the darkened void. The shadows shifted around her, their forms moving like liquid. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She heard the man's voice echoing behind her, calm and controlled.
There's nowhere to run, Emily. The shadows are everywhere.
But she didn't care. She had to keep moving. The darkness around her seemed to shift and warp as she ran, the figures growing closer, their presence suffocating. Every step felt heavier, like she was sinking deeper into the void, the weight of the shadows pressing down on her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning with every inhalation. She didn't know where she was going. There was no clear path, no end in sight. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Suddenly a figure appeared in front of her, blocking her path. Emily skidded to a halt, her heart leaping into her throat as she stumbled back. It was Mr. Halverson. His face was pale, his eyes filled with regret and something deeper, something that looked like pain. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched.
Emily, I'm sorry.
Emily's chest tightened as she stared at him, her emotions a tangled mess of fear, anger, and betrayal.
You lied to me. You let them do this to me.
Mr. Halverson's shoulders slumped, and he lowered his hand.
I tried to protect you.
He said, his voice barely audible.
But I failed. I didn't know how powerful they were. I didn't know they'd never let us escape.
Tears welled in Emily's eyes, her anger giving way to a crushing sense of helplessness.
What do they want from me?
Mr. Halverson looked away, his expression pained.
They don't want anything from you, Emily. They just want you to be part of them, to be consumed by the shadows.
No. I won't let them take me. I won't be part of this.
The man in black's voice echoed through the darkness, cold and unrelenting.
You don't have a choice.
Emily's breath hitched as she turned, her eyes darting around the void. The shadowy figures had closed in now, their presence oppressive, suffocating. She could feel the coldness radiating from them, the emptiness they carried, and it chilled her to the bone. Her body trembled as she looked back at Mr. Halverson, her voice pleading.
Is there no way out?
Mr. Halverson met her gaze, his eyes filled with sorrow.
There's only one way.
The darkness shifted around them as the man in black stepped forward, his smile cold and cruel.
It's time, Emily.
Her heart raced as she backed away, every fiber of her being screaming to resist. But the shadows pressed in from all sides, their presence overwhelming. She could feel them now, cold hands brushing against her skin, pulling her deeper into the void.
No. I won't let you take me.
But the shadows didn't listen. They closed in, their dark tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her into the abyss. Emily struggled, her body fighting against the cold, suffocating darkness. But it was no use. The shadows were too strong. As the darkness consumed her, the last thing she saw was Mr. Halvorson's face, his eyes filled with regret. And then, everything went black. When Emily opened her eyes, she was no longer in the void. She was standing in the middle of a bustling city street, the world around her bright and alive. People walked past her, cars honked in the distance, and the sun shone high in the sky. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream. The shadows, the man in black, the nightmare she had endured. It all seemed so far away now. But as she looked around, a sinking feeling crept into her chest. Something was wrong. The people around her moved in perfect sync, their movements eerily precise. No one looked at her. No one acknowledged her presence. It was as if she didn't exist. Her heart raced as she turned, searching for some sign of familiarity. But everything felt off. And then in the distance, she saw him. The man in black stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her with those same cold, calculating eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent reminder of the nightmare she had escaped. Except she hadn't escaped. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was still in the shadows. This wasn't the real world. This was their world. The man in black's voice echoed in her mind, soft and cold.
Welcome to the shadows, Emily. There's no way out.
Her chest tightened as she backed away, the world around her spinning. The people continued to move past her, oblivious to her fear, their movements mechanical, controlled. She was trapped in their world, forever a part of the shadows. There was no escape, no way out. As the darkness closed in around her, Emily's last thought was a cold, chilling whisper that echoed through the endless void of her mind. I'm one of them now.